In the summer of 536, the sun turned pale, not dim the way it fades behind storm clouds or winter haze, pale the way the moon looks at noon, a milky disk you could stare at directly without squinting, hanging in a sky that had turned a permanent, sulphurous yellow. In Constantinople, the Byzantine historian Procopius recorded something he clearly struggled to describe. He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He was not writing poetry, he was not crafting metaphor, he was describing what he saw every single day for 18 months. Crops failed across the Mediterranean. Snow fell in China in August. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, an enormous collapse in climate terms, and stayed there. Famine spread across 3 continents. And then, as if the darkened sky had been a signal, the worst pandemic in recorded human history, to that point the Plague of Justinian, erupted 6 years later and killed between 25 and 50 million people. Historians have called 536 the worst year to be alive in human history. But here is the part that should disturb you more than the darkness itself. For nearly 1,500 years, almost nobody in the modern historical profession connected these events into a single causal sequence. The volcanic eruption, the climate collapse, the famine, the plague, the fall of entire civilizations. They were studied in separate departments, published in separate journals, filed under separate centuries. The catastrophe was real. The evidence was always there. The connection was simply never made. The first pattern that emerges from 536 is not atmospheric. It is dendrochronological, written in the rings of trees. In 1998, the dendrochronologist Mike Bailey at Queen's University Belfast published a study that would take more than a decade to receive the attention it deserved. He had been analysing Irish oak tree ring sequences stretching back thousands of years, and he found something stark. Beginning precisely in 536, tree growth across Ireland collapsed. Not a gradual thinning. A cliff. Rings so narrow they were barely measurable, persisting for nearly a decade. Bailey cross-referenced this with tree ring data from Scandinavia, from Siberia, from the western United States. The same signature appeared everywhere, the same year, the same abrupt narrowing, the same decade-long suppression of growth. Trees do not lie. They do not exaggerate. They do not have political agendas or institutional funding to protect. They simply grow in proportion to the light and warmth they receive, and in 536 they received almost none. The narrowest rings in the entire sequence, spanning more than 2,000 years of data, clustered in 2 brutal spikes, 536 and 540. 2 catastrophic events, 4 years apart, each one driving temperatures further down, each one extending the darkness. Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica later confirmed the mechanism. Sulfate deposits, the chemical fingerprint of massive volcanic eruptions, spiked at both dates. The eruptions were real. Their atmospheric consequences were measurable. Their human consequences were, by any honest accounting, civilization-altering. And yet, for the better part of the 20th century, the primary historical narratives of this period, the fall of classical antiquity, the transition into the early medieval world, the collapse of long-distance trade networks, were told without meaningful reference to climate. The fall of Rome had its barbarians. The Dark Ages had their cultural explanations. The Plague of Justinian had its epidemiology. But the sky itself, the 18 months of dimmed sun, the failed harvests, the frozen summers, was treated as a footnote. Not suppressed exactly, just never given a chair at the table. To understand why this matters, you need to see the world as it existed just before the sky changed. By the early 6th century, the late Roman and post-Roman world was not the collapsed ruin that popular imagination sometimes suggests. The Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian was arguably the most powerful state on earth. Constantinople held 500,000 people. Roman law was being codified in a project that would become the foundation of European legal systems for the next millennium. Justinian's general Belisarius had just reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and was preparing to retake Italy. Trade routes stretched from Ireland to Sri Lanka. Silk moved along corridors connecting China to the Mediterranean. The world was connected in ways that would not be matched again for nearly 1,000 years. In Scandinavia, a wealthy warrior culture was building elaborate halls and accumulating gold at a pace visible in the archaeological record. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan, one of the largest urban centers on the planet, home to perhaps 125,000 people, was at or near its peak. In the Arabian Peninsula, complex trade networks fed the caravan cities of the Hejaz. The world in 535 was, by the standards of its time, thriving. Then came March of 536. The most likely source of the first eruption identified through sulfate analysis and tephra particles trapped in ice cores was a volcano in Iceland, or possibly in North America. The identification remains debated. What is not debated is the consequence. Within weeks of the eruption, a veil of sulfate aerosols spread across the stratosphere of the northern hemisphere. Sunlight dropped, temperatures plummeted. The Byzantine Empire recorded crop failures. The Chinese court recorded unseasonable frost. The Irish annals recorded bread shortages. And the Scandinavian archaeological record shows something that speaks louder than any chronicle: a sudden, dramatic abandonment of farms and settlements across southern Sweden and Norway, beginning precisely in this window. Gold hoards were buried, halls were emptied. An entire layer of the Scandinavian elite appears to have simply vanished from the material record within a single generation. Then, in 540, a second eruption struck. This one likely originated in the tropics, possibly El Chichen in Mexico, possibly Ilopango in El Salvador, a candidate whose caldera lake still sits in the landscape today, like a scar the earth refuses to close. The second eruption drove temperatures down even further. The decade between 536 and 545 represents the coldest sustained period in the Northern Hemisphere in the last 2,000 years. Not the coldest single year, the coldest decade. And it was not natural variation, it was volcanic winter layered on volcanic winter, with no recovery time between them. The second pattern does not emerge from tree rings or ice cores. It emerges from graves. In 2018, a team of researchers led by the medieval historian Kyle Harper published findings that reframed the Plague of Justinian, the pandemic that struck the Mediterranean world in 541 and 542, not as a separate catastrophe, but as a direct consequence of the climate collapse that preceded it. The mechanism was not mysterious. Famine weakens immune systems. Climate disruption displaces animal populations, particularly rodents, the primary carriers of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. When harvests fail and granaries empty, rats migrate into human settlements in search of food. When temperatures shift unpredictably, flea populations, the vectors that transfer plague from rats to humans, behave unpredictably as well. The plague arrived in Pelusium, the Egyptian port city at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, in 541. Within months it had reached Constantinople, where Procopius, the same historian who had recorded the dimming of the sun 5 years earlier, now recorded the death of 10,000 people per day at the pandemic's peak. Modern historians have debated that number. But recent ancient DINA analysis, published in journals including Nature and the Lancet Infectious Diseases, has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in burial sites across the Mediterranean, the British Isles, and Central Europe dating to this exact period. The plague was real. Its geographic reach was enormous, and its timing arriving precisely when populations across 3 continents were already weakened by 5 years of crop failure, cold summers, and famine was not coincidental. It was consequential. Harper and his colleagues went further. They argued that the combined impact of the volcanic winter and the plague fundamentally altered the trajectory of Mediterranean civilization. The population of the Eastern Roman Empire may have declined by 25 to 40%. Tax revenues collapsed. Military recruitment became impossible at previous scales. Justinian's reconquest of Italy, already struggling, became a Pyrrhic endeavour, draining resources from an empire that could no longer replace its dead. The architectural ambitions of the age slowed. The legal reforms continued on paper, but the society they were meant to govern was shrinking. The connection between climate and plague was not speculative. It was epidemiological, demographic, and archaeologically visible. But for most of the 20th century, the two events were studied by entirely different academic disciplines: climatologists and volcanologists on one side, historians and epidemiologists on the other, with almost no institutional framework for combining their findings into a single coherent narrative. Here is where the two patterns converge, and where the implications become difficult to set aside. The volcanic winter of 536 to 545 did not merely cause a famine. It did not merely trigger a plague. It restructured the human world. Consider the sequence as a single, connected event rather than a series of separate misfortunes, and the picture changes fundamentally. In Scandinavia, the climate collapse coincides precisely with the end of the migration period, and the beginning of what archaeologists call the Vendel period, a cultural reset so thorough that it shows up in burial customs, settlement patterns, metalwork styles, and the sudden disappearance of entire regional populations from the archaeological record. The Old Norse sagas preserve a memory of this time as Fimbulvetter, the Great Winter, a mythological catastrophe that precedes the end of the world. Scholars have long debated whether Fimbulvetter reflects a real climatic event. The tree rings suggest it does. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan, which had dominated central Mexican politics, trade, and religion for centuries, experienced a catastrophic fire and partial abandonment in the mid-6th century. The exact date is debated. The volcanic record from Ilopango, less than 1,000 kilometers away, is not. In the Arabian Peninsula, the disruption of long-distance trade routes and the agricultural collapse in the Fertile Crescent created the preconditions for a wholesale restructuring of political and religious authority in the region, changes that would culminate, within a century, in the rise of Islam. No serious historian attributes the rise of Islam to a volcano, but serious historians are increasingly willing to acknowledge that the social, economic, and political soil in which that transformation took root was turned and broken by a climate catastrophe that has only recently been understood. The point is not that a volcanic eruption caused the modern world. The point is that a volcanic eruption, two of them, in fact destabilized the ancient world so thoroughly that entirely new civilizations grew in the spaces left behind. And for most of recorded historiography, that destabilization was either unknown, minimized, or filed under natural background noise, when it was, in measurable, documented, verifiable fact, the single most consequential environmental event in 1500 years. The question of why this connection took so long to be made is not trivial. It is, in many ways, the most revealing part of the entire story. The evidence was never hidden. Procopius wrote about the dimming sun in the 6th century. The Chinese court historians recorded the anomalous weather. The Irish annals noted the famines. The tree ring data was available by the 1980s. The ice core sulfate data was published in the 1990s. But the institutional structure of modern historical scholarship is organized by period, by region, and by discipline, not by climate. A Roman historian studies Rome. A sinologist studies China. A volcanologist studies eruptions. A medievalist studies the early medieval period. 536 falls in a gap too late for classical antiquity, too early for the medieval period proper, too global for any single regional specialty, too scientific for the humanities, too historical for the sciences. It lived in a no-man's land between disciplines, not suppressed, not censored, just structurally invisible. When Mike Bailey published his tree ring findings, they were received politely in dendrochronology circles and almost entirely ignored by mainstream historians for years. When ice core researchers identified the sulfate spikes, the data was published in geochemistry journals that historians did not read. When Kyle Harper finally synthesized the climate, plague, and political data into a single narrative in his 2017 book, The Fate of Rome, reviewers called it groundbreaking. But the data he synthesized had been available in separate silos for decades. The erasure was not intentional, it was structural, and structural erasure is, in many ways, harder to correct than deliberate suppression, because there is no villain to confront, no classified document to declassify, no conspiracy to expose. There is only the slow, silent way that institutional boundaries become intellectual walls, and the way those walls can hide a catastrophe in plain sight for 1,000 years. The physical evidence of 536 is everywhere, and it is not subtle. The ice cores from the Greenland GISP-2 project and the Antarctic Epica project are archived, measured, and published. The sulfate spikes at 536 and 540 are unambiguous among the largest volcanic signals in the entire Holocene record. The tree ring chronologies compiled by Bailey and later expanded by researchers across Europe, Asia, and North America are publicly accessible. The narrowest growth rings of the last 2 millennia are visible under magnification to anyone who examines the archived samples. In Sweden, the abandoned farms of the 6th century are still being excavated. At Uppsala, near Lund, one of the largest and most important Scandinavian settlements of the Iron Age, the archaeological layers corresponding to the mid-6th century show a sharp decline in material wealth and ritual activity. In Turkey, the Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, 1 year into the volcanic winter, still stands. It was built during a famine. Its construction workforce operated under a darkened sky. The ambition of that building, set against the catastrophe of the year in which it was finished, is a contradiction that few architectural histories pause to examine. In El Salvador, the Ilopango caldera, now Lake Ilopango, stretches nearly 11 kilometers across. The Tierra Blanca Joven eruption that may have contributed to the 540 event deposited volcanic ash across an area of at least 10,000 square kilometers, burying mine settlements under meters of tephra. Some of those settlements are still being uncovered. The ash layer is still measurable in the soil. The evidence is not ambiguous. It is not circumstantial. It is layered into the physical record of the planet itself, in ice, in wood, in stone, in ash, in bone. It was always there. The question was never whether it existed. The question was whether anyone would read all of it at once. The sun came back. That is the strange, almost disorienting coda to this story. By the late 540s, the aerosol veil thinned. Temperatures began to recover, though full recovery to pre-536 levels would take more than a century in some regions. Crops grew again. Trade resumed, though along different routes, between different powers, under different names. The world that emerged from the decade of darkness was not the world that had entered it. Justinian's empire survived, but never regained its former reach. Scandinavia reorganized around new elites, whose origins remain poorly understood. Teotihuacan smoldered and contracted. The Arabian Peninsula began a transformation that would reshape the map of 3 continents. The plague recurred in waves for 200 years, each recurrence finding a population that had not yet recovered from the last. And the connection between all of these, the thread that linked the dimmed sun to the mass graves, to the abandoned farms, to the new religions, to the redrawn borders, remained unstudied as a unified phenomenon until living memory. 1,500 years. The evidence preserved in ice and wood and ash, the chronicles written and copied and shelved, the tree rings counted and catalogued and filed, and still, the story was not told whole until the 21st century. Consider what else might be sitting in the gaps between disciplines, visible in the data but invisible in the narrative. Consider what other catastrophes have been broken into fragments and distributed across specialties until no single scholar sees the full shape. Consider what the trees are recording right now, in rings that will not be read for decades, about events whose connections we have not yet learned to make. The ice cores are still accumulating. The trees are still growing. The evidence is still being written, and the sky has darkened before.